Hey there, everybody. This is Valerie. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles, your podcast for all things spiritual growth and development in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints tradition. Today, I am here with you. I am going to talk to you guys today. I'm going to address a question that one of you listeners brought up with me through one of my many communications that I've been having over the last few weeks and months. And I'm grateful for all of you. As I begin, I wanted to say thank you so much for so many of you who are sharing this podcast. The downloads are doubling weekly, and in some cases, even in less than a week. So clearly, there is a huge need. And I have you guys to thank for getting the word out, for spreading the need that we all have to better understand and support one another as we walk through the complexities that we're going through in some of the struggles that we're having as a church community here in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Okay, so today I wanted to address this question. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but basically one of the women, it was a woman because I remember it being a woman when we communicated, but she said, "I love your podcast, but I have to be honest with you, it's overwhelming and it brings up immense emotion and grief. The more I understand, the more I see things differently, more clearly, the more my eyes are opened. On the one hand, I'm both grateful, but on the other hand, it's emotionally overwhelming and somewhat it brings up a lot of grief." And so she said, "Can you please talk to me or us as a community about how to handle this from your perspective as not only a truth teller, but also as a therapist?" And so I thought to myself, you know what, I can do that. I can take that challenge up and I can talk about that. I can talk about that both from my trauma therapist's perspective, but also I would love to share with you guys some of my own musings and some of my own personal experiences. I myself have gone through this journey, maybe in some cases just a couple steps ahead of you guys, but maybe in some cases I'm a little bit behind some of you guys. I have enjoyed so much these small groups that I'm beginning to run, and I've noticed in at least a few cases, some of the folks that I am being lucky enough to meet, face to face, they're a little ahead of me. They've been down this road, and they've actually been navigating this with a lot of finesse for many, many years. And that is not the case with me. Nathan and I are rather young in this place that we are in. I wouldn't say months old, but we're certainly not 20 or 30 years old like some of the folks that I'm having the privilege of meeting. And so I'm going to just share with you guys some of my own experiences and how I personally am navigating this, because this is very tender and real for me. So just be aware. Those of you who know me well, I'm an emotional, and proud to say it, I'm somebody who has a lot of emotion, and I'm willing, and well, sometimes I can't help it even if I wasn't willing. But I may get a little bit emotional here in this episode. Okay, so let's go ahead and just jump in and talk a little bit about this that many of you either are going through or perhaps have gone through before, and maybe you're a little bit beyond this, and so you can be one who offers a loving hand of support to those of us who may be a little bit behind you as you have moved out of orthodoxy and into skepticism. In short, when your shelf has broken, when it began to be heavier and you were noticing more items being piled up on the shelf of your faith, of the simple faith that you had, of that firm foundation that you felt that you had in our faith. And then you noticed, as life happened, as things changed, as people evolved, as you evolved, as you read more, as you learned more, as you grew more, and you started to recognize that things are not as simple as you thought they were. And it was terrifying and maybe even devastating, because when we have been raised in a system where all of the answers seem to be clear and certain, and it brings us a lot of management of our own anxiety. And of course, we want those things to be true. And that's why I think in some ways our church is able to attract so many people, because it gives a lot of nice, crisp, and clean answers to some of the bigger and hairier questions of life. And who wouldn't want that? And yet at the same time, the problem is that in many cases, what we come to recognize in our own growth and development is many of those answers were not either correct or were not sufficient, or were based on misinformation and some of the false traditions of the early traditions of our church. So then we have to manage the complexity of being part of, or if we choose to stay a part of, at least provisionally, at least today, those of us who are choosing to stay in, we have to navigate a lot of big feelings. These are feelings of heartbreak. These are feelings of betrayal. These are feelings of confusion, of disorientation, of a sense of what else do I not know, a sense of feeling as if we have been lied to in some cases, and a sense of disorientation even around how we interact with the people, some of whom we love the most, some of them our own nuclear families, our own families of origin, our parents, our cousins, our friends, our ward friends, our neighbors. It feels in some ways like we have entered into a brave new world, and we oftentimes do not feel as if we have the skills for it, and it's psychologically incredibly undoing. Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you about is I'm going to actually break down in my pondering and thinking about how to address this with you guys. I've come up with actually 10 points that I wanted you to think about as you are navigating this faith crisis grief process. First and foremost, I want to begin by validating that in cases that you're describing, when truth has been discovered rather than disclosed, it is devastating. This is when I work with someone who's gone through a trauma, maybe sort of like an infidelity situation, or something has been discovered of somebody or some situation that someone thought they knew, and they discover of their own accord that it was not as it seemed. It's incredibly disorienting and disorganizing to the brain. Trauma, by definition, is when we thought we could make sense of something, whether it be a human being, a system, or a situation in our lives, when we thought our brain was like ordered around it and it made sense. And then we come to realize that it isn't as we thought it was. And we are confronted with needing to make sense of something when we feel as if we have sort of everything has been sort of tipped upside down on us. And most of the time, also in cases of trauma, we realize this in some with some feeling of isolation. So not only has the world tipped upside down, something that we thought we understood is completely not as we understand it anymore. It happens rather suddenly sometimes. We discover it when we were not necessarily expecting to discover this thing. And we don't necessarily feel like we have a support system around us. And so we're feeling overwhelmed, discombobulated, and very, very, very alone. So discovery is what many of us have been exposed to or gone through in our own faith journeys, especially in our Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faith journey, because a lot of what we were taught as children turns out to not be as it really was. And this, of course, we can thank the internet for, when much of the truth claims of our faith, and also a lot of the historical claims, the narratives that were sort of correlated through our childhoods, what became exposed was that a lot of that was manufactured, or at least finessed in a way to where they were faith promoting, but not necessarily always true. And so when we discover something, it feels like the assault is worse than if it was disclosed to us. Now, to the church's credit, of course, over the years, there has been some baby steps towards disclosure, but oftentimes the disclosure feels a little bit too little and a little bit too late. Sorry, something just fell off of a shelf over across the room there. I should have seen that coming. I'd noticed it was sort of tipping. Okay, so that brings us to point number 2. So first and foremost, like I said, as you're navigating this grief process, as you go into and are experiencing faith crisis, I want you to just recognize, I want you to feel valid in the massive amounts of emotion and disorientation that you're feeling. And you're not crazy, you're not weak, there's not something wrong with you. This is a typical trauma response when discovery has been made, especially about something that is so core to your whole identity, which is your faith. That is really, really deeply embedded in us. It's not only just what we believe, but it's why we believe. Through our faith, we are able to sort of make sense of all sorts of other things. It is sort of, in some ways, the foundation upon which we build everything else. And so when that starts to topple, it is legitimately very, very, very traumatic and devastating. So don't feel like you're crazy or there's something wrong with you, or even the fact that you're feeling extremely disoriented or traumatized, that's unusual, because it's actually not. That brings me to my second point, which is take these things in small bits and pieces. I can speak personally for this. I have jumped into the deep end of this many months ago when colleague Brandon Patrick and I decided we wanted to speak openly about this on the podcast. It occurred to me that there were some things that I knew about and there were some things that I did not know about and probably needed to learn about. I needed to pull my ostrich, the part of myself that was sort of ostrich, the ostrich part of my head that was in the ground. I needed to pull it out of the ground, and I needed to start actually doing some earnest searching for myself. And I did that. I really began to study. And as you all know, I am a voracious reader, and I read and read and read and read and read. And there were occasions when I did feel in some ways so shocked and overwhelmed and betrayed and upset and even depressed that it was kind of undoing for me. And so what I would recommend for you guys is take it easy, go slowly, and really try to get a sense of what your own particular window of tolerance is. Now, the window of tolerance is a term coined by Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a wonderful, wonderful child psychiatrist. And he's really, really one of those experts in the brain and interpersonal neurobiology. And one of the things he really talks about that I want to share with you guys is we all have various windows of tolerance, things that we can handle and that we can handle well. Most of the time, growth happens when we are just at the edge, the outer edge of our window of tolerance, meaning that it's not so simple that it bores us, but it's not so overwhelming that it overcomes us. And so when we're learning something, it's good for us to feel like we can push ourselves a little bit beyond what we think we can do, but then also give ourselves the grace that sometimes we need to take a break. We need to stop. If we're feeling a little bit of stress and tension because we're learning something, that's not a bad thing. If we're feeling psychologically or even physiologically overwhelmed with what we're learning, sometimes that may be a sign that we have passed our own psychological window of tolerance, and it's time to take a break and resource ourselves, get strong again, and then we can dig back in and do some more learning. So in the learning of what your own particular window of tolerance is, the way I would sort of manage that, or the way I have personally managed it, is I sort of just pay a lot of attention to my own body. I pay attention to what physiologically is happening as I'm learning new things. Is my heart starting to race? Are my hands getting clammy? Am I starting to feel an overwhelming amount of stress or grief? I wouldn't say that if you're feeling tearful or sad, but you're also still feeling pretty physiologically regulated, I wouldn't say that is probably outside of your window of tolerance, but most of us know what it feels like when we start to go into almost like a panic mode, or we start to feel psychologically or physiologically overwhelmed, like our world starts to spin. That's when we just pull away from whatever that book is, the podcast is, even this one, or whatever it is that we're consuming. Just take a break and take care of yourself. That means that, and I'm really, really big on self-care. I frequently talk about the 5 pillars of self-care. If all of us did these things, we would be so psychologically and spiritually healthy that I'd probably have no job, which would be wonderful. But what we need to do to take care of ourselves consistently, regardless of what it is that we're going through. But faith crisis is a big piece of that. We need to take care of ourselves when we're in any kind of crisis. And in our case, when we're in faith crises, these are 5 components of self-care. Number 1, get ample sleep. The other one is take good care of your body in terms of feeding it well. Daily, consistent exercise works wonders for our mental and spiritual health. Daily and consistent relational, how do I say this? Being in connection daily with relationships that pour into us. So those of you out there that are consistently and always caregiving, this is a time where you need to reverse that a little bit, or maybe even a lot of it, and make sure you're staying tightly connected with people that are pouring into you. And the 5th component of self-care is having a consistent relationship with meditation and mindfulness. I could spend a whole lot of other time talking about that, but I probably won't. Those are the 5 pillars of mental and emotional health. Okay, so point number 1 was recognize that you're not crazy. There's nothing wrong with you or unusual that you're feeling trauma symptoms, because this is, in fact, can be very traumatic. Point number 2 is recognize and notice your window of tolerance and really practice those 5 pillars of self-care. Okay, point number 3, this is a little bit of an expansion of one of the subpoints in point number 2, is find your people. I can't tell you how grateful I am that as I have embarked on this process, I have been lucky enough to have a partner who has been open and willing to listen and willing to, he's basically said, send that over to me, send me that article. I do a lot more casual reading than he does. like a lot more. I'm a big reader, and he frequently will listen to me kind of download to him the books that I'm reading, and he'll oftentimes choose the books that interest him most, and he will read those with me so that we can have conversations. So you need to find someone that is willing to listen to you and to tolerate what it is that you're going through. It doesn't obviously need to be a partner. And in many cases, many of us may not have partners or may not have partners that are in the same psychological or spiritual, have the same ability to tolerate where you are. But you can find somebody, you can find a friend. Like I have mentioned before, because of the enormity of the need, I am contemplating, I'm starting these small groups, and I will, if the need is there, I will actually shift away from some of my individual work in my private practice. And I'm going to be willing to expand this group work because I could have never anticipated the gravity and the need that has been exposed through this little podcast of mine. So if you have a network of people, all the better. If you don't, I would encourage you to look for somebody, if it's whoever this can be, because this is the kind of thing where we need each other. When we're in a situation like the beginnings of a faith crisis, this in and of itself can be a traumatic experience. It is growth oriented and it has all of the potential to be something that is projecting you forward in your own faith development. However, at the very beginning, it feels nothing more or less than completely disorienting and completely traumatic. And if something like this happens that's traumatic and we do it in isolation, it will indeed become another new multidimensional trauma. So we need each other. Things that when we have an experience that is painful, but we are in connection with others that can support us, most of the time, they do not become calcified in our brains and bodies as trauma. So please, please, please look for a network where you can have the support that you need. If you're interested in joining one of my small groups, it's a 1 hour a week Zoom experience. Reach out to me at info@valeriehamaker.com. One of them is full. I'm starting 2 more in the month of October 2022. If you listen to this later on and you're still interested, and it's months or years later, check in with me and I'll tell you if I'm still doing these. Okay, point number 4. So I'm going to review. Point number 1 is discovery is traumatic. Point number 2 is start to better understand your own window of tolerance and take care of yourself. Point number 3 is process what you're going through with safe others that can support and love you. Point number 4 is use your growing catalog of resources. I want you to recognize how many resources you actually have. Okay. So back before the internet, if this happened, most of the time people just languished in isolation. They would either leave or they would button it up and stay and become what they call secular believers, meaning that they're not really believers, but they stay involved in the community because it's the only choice they have if they want to have any community at all. Recognize now that because of the internet, there are support systems. Recognize that there are podcasts. Recognize that there are other places and opportunities where you can go to find support. Now, notice, I want you to just pay close attention. I have gotten a little bit more educated on this myself in the last few months as I have delved into this world myself, that there are some resources out there online that are less helpful and others that are more helpful. I would encourage you, these are just thoughts that I have based on my own experiences. Some of these groups or some of these podcasts, even some of the books or experiences are with folks that are angry and disenchanted, but they don't necessarily bring about, in my opinion, they don't help me. They may actually have some good points, but they're not necessarily helping me understand the nature of the problem and even giving me the resourcing that I need to know how to manage my own particular situation. In other words, I'm not interested in somebody that is trying to convince me, come what may, to stay in the church. I'm also not interested in somebody who has a big agenda that I need to leave the church. I'm also noticing that a lot of these places, although they have personal experiences regarding what happened to them, they haven't made sense of the nature of the problem. They don't have that psychology background. They don't have an understanding of organizational structures and of group dynamics, things like that. I wouldn't necessarily expect everybody to know those things, but I'm really cautious myself in choosing into groups where I feel like there's an openness for people to share their experience and an openness for people to allow me to have whatever my experience is, whether it be choosing to sort of try to navigate the complexities of a faith system that is messy and broken, but having my own reasons to want to stay and reform, or whether it be that I choose to step away, but do so from a psychologically healthy place. I want to make sure that I'm feeling supported by others, regardless of what my choices are, and that this community is something that has an openness to allow me to have my process. Okay, so point number 4 was use your what did I say? Use your growing catalog of resources, many of which are online. But I'm also noticing I've had many people tell me that there are quite a few small groups of nuanced people that are finding each other on the internet. I don't know exactly how they're always I mean, I know there are like big Facebook groups, but I also noticed there are I've heard of many of these smaller groups of, in some cases, women who have come together and they have luncheons together or they have meetings together. So I would suppose that what's going on there is somebody has enough courage to say what they're going through, and somebody says, me too. And then they start talking, and then a third and a fourth and a fifth people start. So even if you don't join my group, it's great to recognize that there are ways that we cannot be isolated and we can support and love one another. Okay. Point number 5 is I want you to begin to recognize, as you're working through this faith crisis grief, is I want you to begin to have an increasing understanding of how alone you are not. And what I mean by that is, from my own personal experience, just in doing this podcast in the last few months, I am overwhelmed at how many of us that are active in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are actually having a very, very, very similar experience. So I want you to reflect on the fact that you are not alone. And I'm actually getting ready, Nathan and I are getting ready to do a pretty information-packed 5-part series that is starting next episode, I think, if I can get my act together, where we are going to actually do a deep analysis of something called the LDS Personal Faith Crisis Report. It's something that was given to me by a member of one of my small groups that is a detailed analysis of faith crisis that was published in the middle, like I think it was 2013, that was actually presented to many of the brethren at church headquarters, helping them, inviting them to better understand the gravity of the issue of faith crisis. So I want you guys to buckle up, because we're going to go deeply into that for 5 full episodes. But what this actually communicated to me and really impressed upon me as I was reading and studying this is a big deal. And I don't want us to each feel that we're in our homes, at the grocery store, on a jog, doing whatever it is that we're doing in our life all alone in this struggle. So keep recognizing, I hope you're noticing that I'm trying to help you see that in the grief that you're feeling, there's something incredibly important about knowing that we're not alone and that this issue is widespread. And my hope is that because it's a widespread issue and it's being publicized as best as people are able to publicize it, and as courageous people are willing to come forward and talk about it, to the extent that we are able to talk about it and actually communicate the gravity of the problem and that it is widespread in our church, that is the only way that this is ever going to actually be addressed. So recognize that you're not alone and that the numbers are climbing and have begun to climb really when the internet came about, but they've actually been exponentially climbing since about 2010, if I'm remembering correctly from the Faith Crisis Report. You're going to hear a lot more about that starting in my next episode. Okay, point number 6, and this is something that I want to just share with you that I have done on my bad days, is I try really hard to reflect on the brave reformers that I am inspired by. Sometimes it feels extraordinarily scary for me to be an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and to be doing a podcast like this. I am less frightened all the time because I'm feeling such a call and I'm feeling such a sense of mission and duty and purpose. A lot of the reason that I feel that is because I've had a lot of confirming witnesses, just personal experiences that I'm doing the right thing. And I'm going to share a little bit more with you about that a little bit later on in this episode. But I also really appreciate your coming out yourselves and the messages that you're sending, the tons of emails that I get, the ratings and reviews on the podcast that so many of you are doing, the private messages on Instagram. We are a fairly mighty army. And by nature of the fact that this podcast is growing so quickly, I don't begin to think it's because of my oratorial skills or anything like that. But I do think it is because I'm brave, and I'm trying to be like the two people that I'm about ready to talk about. And this is who I think about on my bad days. I think about Eve. I think about Mother Eve, who is truly one of the greatest reformers of our history. Now, whether or not she's sort of a real figure that actually lived or a metaphorical figure that can teach us great things through biblical literature is irrelevant to me, because either way, the story of the creation and of our first parents, Adam and Eve, is incredibly informative and instructive to me, that the woman had to stand up against the rigidity and the strict obedience of the man. And in some ways, Eve is basically my spirit animal. I recognize that had Eve not chosen to partake of the fruit and to do the thing that was sort of went against the grain and had to live outside of the validation, at least temporarily, of her partner, then the plan of salvation would not have begun. And Eve had to have the courage to sort of see something broader, see something bigger, see something deeper. She had to recognize that she wasn't necessarily going to get the validation of the people in her community, which her community, according to the legend or the story or the scripture, her community was Adam. She had to recognize that she only had allegiance to God, and that she was going to do the right thing independent of, come hell or high water. Even if it meant she was going to get kicked out of the beautiful Garden of Eden, she was going to do the right thing, because that's who she was. That was in her nature. And so I think of Eve when I feel scared, or when I feel like, what are you doing? What are you doing, Valerie? Why are you're coloring outside of the lines? And so that's one character that I think about. And the other, of course, that I think about is I think about our own Savior, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was unpopular. The official church, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scholars, they hated him. He was rejected. He was reviled. He was beaten. He was whipped. He was abused. He was crucified. And he wasn't necessarily interested in what the formal organization of the church thought of him. And that's who I'm trying to emulate in my own clunky, imperfect way. And so as you are wrestling and having to do brave things and say brave things, whether it is that you're choosing to stay on the edge of the inside, or you're choosing to step away for your own reasons, or choosing to speak up on social media, or raise your hand in a second hour class, whatever it is, whatever your small or otherwise version of reforming and being brave, I want you to just remember these other reformers that have come before you, that are giving you and can continue to give me the strength that we need to be instruments truly in the hands of God, as we're trying to bring about truth and true goodness and true religion and true worship. Okay, let's move on to point number 7. Okay, now this is going to be kind of points number 7 and points number 8 are sort of interlinked. I want you to recognize, as you're walking through this struggle, this faith crisis, I want you to recognize that there are things that have happened in your life, and there are resources, internal resources that you personally have, that you can thank your religious education for. Your religious education in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has given you many gifts. Now, I can't recount the gifts that it has given you, but maybe some of what I can share with you about myself can resonate with you. And maybe then you can add on to my list your own resources that you can thank your spiritual education for. Number one, I am really, really grateful for what I was trained in my own Mormon tradition family. I'm really grateful for the work ethic that I have. I am a tenacious little worker. I think it's my multi-generations of pioneer blood from both sides of my family that is just a deep and profound part of me. And that is the thing that keeps me driven and keeps me able to do this podcast. So thank you to the Mormon tradition and my pioneer ancestors that have given me the ability to really, really be tenacious and to never give up. Something else that I feel, and I've heard a lot of people talk about in their own processing of their own faith crisis, is that one of the reasons why we're also distressed, you guys, is because the church itself has embedded in us a deep and profound appreciation of the idea of truth. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why we feel traumatized when the institution that has taught us truth is also the same entity that is not being truthful. But I want you to think about how you personally have been resourced. You have spiritual gifts that the church and your education in the church, in primary and seminary and whatnot, that has taught you about the valiance of truth and the pursuit of truth over all other things. So I want you to think about, while this makes it awkward right now that you're actually having to push up against the very institution that taught you this principle, the principle itself is actually a divinely good and a whole principle that is helping you and resourcing you to do the work that you need to do in your faith crisis. Okay, I'm just going to give you those. Those are two of the examples, but I want you to think about, well, let me give you a couple more actually. Many of us can thank our education in and our experience with the church for our relationship with God, especially with Heavenly Father and with our Savior, Jesus Christ. I am forever grateful for what I have learned and who I have become because of my membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and my understanding of the atonement of Jesus Christ as I have come to understand it through the words, through the readings that I've done in the Book of Mormon. I thank this institution for that education. I am profoundly grateful for my habit of daily and often hourly prayer. I'm not somebody that's kneeling down all the time here and there and everywhere, but I feel like I'm in constant conversation with my divine parents. That's just second nature for me. Something else that I have been taught through and that has sort of resourced me in the church is I have really, and again, this is a paradox because we're being formally discouraged about doing this from the formal hierarchy right now, but I have a voracious appetite to learn and to speculate and to better understand the nature of truth, the nature of theology. I am a speculative theologist. I don't know how when I've heard, I think it was Elder Renlund that gave that talk not too long ago about not speculating. You guys, I don't even know how I wouldn't even be Valerie Hamaker if I wasn't constantly speculating. I'm always grappling with and challenging and thinking and growing and finding connections and trying to better understand paradox and truth from error. It is who I am. And believe it or not, I have been cultivated somehow in maybe the high priority in my own family with the idea of learning and growing and challenging. But part of what is sort of coursing through my own DNA is the desire to find truth, to expose truth, to look for truth wherever I can find it in this tradition or otherwise. And that is something that I'm very grateful for. And I believe that is what has strengthened my relationship with God and Jesus Christ. Okay, so those are my resources. As you go through faith crisis, you guys, I want you to think about what resources do you have and in what ways has your education and has your background in and history of and your understanding of who you are through the church, how has it helped you? Okay, now that ties into point number 8. And point number 8 is I also, on the other hand, want you to recognize and give yourselves a whole lot of grace for ways in which the church and your church education has actually, in fact, handicapped you as you enter into this period of faith crisis. And what I mean by that is that, and this is something that I've thought a lot about, is that the church has encouraged a lot of spiritual and psychological underdevelopment. It has encouraged us to not use critical thinking skills. It has encouraged us to turn our judgment that is God-given and our own divine powers of discernment has encouraged us to turn that over to charismatic leaders at the hierarchy, at the highest hierarchies of the institution. So this is a handicap for us as we're going through our own faith crisis. It's another handicap that we have been given as members of the church is that we have been discouraged from ever questioning anybody that has a different idea or that has any kind of authority. We have also been discouraged from questioning historical information. We've also sort of been discouraged from challenging anything, even if it doesn't feel right to us. And in most of our Orthodox days, we blindly obeyed that because it was encouraged to sort of practice a faith that was simple and was sort of composed of blind obedience, non-critical thinking, not studying anything that was outside of, the correlated church efforts to manage church history and doctrine. And so many of us in our Orthodox days did that. And for whatever reason, I certainly give the internet a lot of the credit for this. And some of us just became more educated through universities and whatnot. But we stumbled into a whole new world of actual contradictory and really complex truth that puts us in this spin. So on the one hand, we have been resourced with many things. For example, a tenacious desire to live in truth, but we've also been handicapped by the same church that gave us the resource to desire truth. The handicap is that we don't know how to manage the complexities that come when we are confronted with the fact that our own church has not always been very truthful. Okay, so this is, in my opinion, sometimes why people, and again, I'm not being critical, I'm just saying that it seems to me that this is probably what's going on with many people that sort of leave in a blaze of fire, and they leave the church and are very bitter and angry. For me, and I don't want to judge and blame, maybe they have every reason to do that. I wouldn't pretend to know the specifics of every single person's stories as to why they leave. But my suspicion is that many people leave because when they are confronted with truth, they don't necessarily have the psychological and spiritual maturity to know how to manage the complexity of being confronted with something that is, in fact, very, very complex. And what I'm actually trying to sort of work with you guys on in each and every one of these episodes is, if we become more psychologically and spiritually mature, we're able to navigate the complexities of this church system, of the good parts as well as the bad parts, the blessings as well as the curses that we are experiencing in the system. But we have to have spiritual maturity and psychological maturity to be able to navigate those complicated terrain. And many people do not have that because the church did not endow them, train them, or encourage them to become psychological agents unto themselves. And so oftentimes they feel like the only choice that they have is to leave because they are not equipped with the tools to know how to stay in integrity and manage the complexities within the church, even if it's on the edge of the inside. I want to be very clear here. I am never judgmental of people's actual choices. I am a big advocate of moral agency and everybody's own choices and their reasons for doing so. So let me just double back and offer to you where I am so far as we talk about faith crisis grief and how to manage it. Number one, please feel validated in this as a trauma. Number two, notice your window of tolerance and pay attention to when you feel overwhelmed, and step away and manage and help yourself with the 5 pillars of self-care. Number three, process with others who are safe. Number four, recognize that you have a growing catalog of resources and find those resources that really help you in where you are in your faith journey. Number five, recognize that you are absolutely not alone in this type of grief and confusion. The population of active members of the church is steadily growing, and it is my hope that at some point we will hit an actual tipping point. Number six is think about the reformers. Personally, for me, I think about Jesus Christ and Eve. Number seven is recognize how the church has resourced you. What are the gifts, parts of your own growth and identity that you can thank your membership in the church for? Number eight is recognize with tons of self-compassion how the church has handicapped you and how and why you are ill-equipped to manage faith crisis because of some of the struggles that the church has in helping us become psychologically developed human beings. And number nine is I want you to look for the tender mercies in your life. I want you to notice as you go through faith crisis, when you stumble into something or someone where you just know that God has not abandoned you. And as you can probably tell, this gets me a little bit emotional because I find this has been my own experience when I feel like I just can't do this anymore. This is too complicated. This is too painful. when I just kind of want to throw in the towel, whether it be whatever it is I'm feeling personally, or when I feel overwhelmed with the podcast, because I don't feel like I'm, ahead of y'all enough to be able to even talk about this. But inevitably, I have had experiences where, even though I have a complicated relationship, of course, with the institution, I'm here to say to you guys, I've never actually felt closer to God and to Jesus Christ than I do now. And let me just share with you a couple of things, a couple of experiences that I've had where I just feel so in tune and in touch with the nature of my responsibility, what I am doing personally here on my own errand with my heavenly parents and my Savior, Jesus Christ. If you go back to episode 19, I was pretty self-disclosing and I shared some real anguish and struggle that I was going through. This was a couple of months ago, and a good friend of mine, an old friend of mine who had moved away, really kind of came at me on social media and was pretty nasty to me, kind of in that I'm trying to save you sort of way, but was not nice and was very relentless. I mean, we're talking relentless, would not leave me alone. And I remembered just being overwhelmed and kind of vulnerable at that point in time, feeling like maybe she was right and maybe I was apostate and all those things. And I remember vividly that same weekend being in the temple with my sons and my husband, and a temple worker walking up to me and said, "You seem to really be invested in helping people with faith crisis." And she asked me some really earnest and sincere questions, and was absolutely open and grateful for what I had to share. And what I shared was actually pretty brutally honest. I didn't feel, even in the temple, like I wanted to hedge around any of the truths that I was learning. And she was absolutely open. And I had a real feeling of a sense of like, Valerie, carry on. You're doing fine. You don't need the validation of the haters. Haters gonna hate. My teenagers would be so mortified if they hear that. But the fact of the matter is, we're gonna have people that don't validate us. Okay, so that's one experience. That's a tender mercy from God, helping me understand that I'm okay, even if I'm in crisis and I feel very discombobulated. A couple of other things that are just sort of, they're little things, but they're not very little. For one thing, this happened just this morning in church. I walked into primary, I believe, and the chorister, or the pianist, I'm the chorister. The pianist was playing this song, and it struck me to the core. You guys, it was incredible how, and it was completely unexpected, but the song was "Dare to do right, dare to be true. You have a work that no other can do." I've heard that song 1,000 times, maybe more. It's just one of those, it's in the unsealed portion of the hymns. So we've all sung it 1,000 times. But this time I heard it differently. You have a work that no other could do. And what sunk deep within me is that I am, in fact, on God's errand. And I will continue relentlessly. And I'm not afraid of what will happen to me if anything does. I'm not convinced anything will, but I'm also not convinced on certain days that something won't happen. But the fact of the matter is, when I heard that song, I felt a deep and profound conviction that I am known and that I'm doing something very, very important. And maybe it's to help you. And I want you to think about how you too can do this in your own way, that you can dare to do right, dare to be true, and that there's something that you only can do in your own realm of influence. I'm not here to say what it is that you're supposed to do or need to do or should do. I don't even like to use the word should, but maybe you can know for yourself what it is that you are especially equipped to do. Another hymn that I heard not too long ago was, "I'll go where you want me to go, dear Lord. I'll be what you want me to be." Once again, I've heard that song 1,000 times. And yet once again, I had a witness from the Spirit that I'm doing the right thing and to carry on. Clearly, God is wanting and needing me to, like, I feel like I'm getting a lot of validation from the heavens, because I'm clearly feeling like I'm walking on, I'm shaking a little bit. I'm trembling in the work that I'm doing. And so I'm feeling like I'm being uplifted and held in the hollow of his hand, and that I am doing what is right. And so that, to me, is, once again, it's something that I'm doing as I work through my own faith crisis grief. And finally, I leave this for point number 10. And the reason why I'm doing it at point number 10 is because it feels really important to me that I make very clear that what I'm about to say can and should only be done. There I go, saying the word should right after I said I hate it. But what I'm about ready to talk about, there's a time and a place for this. And that's why I put it at the very end. So the point here is that as we are able and ready, love will enter in and embrace us, and we will be able to have an increased capacity to love. Yes, we will. I can tell you that for sure because it's been my own experience. I have had complicated feelings with all sorts of individuals that have to do with faith crisis, that have to do with our organization. But I've noticed as I've studied that that staying in anger is not the way to actually bring about healing and change. I think it was Carolyn Pearson that said anger is a fine gas station, but it is a terrible home. And I really, really like that because I think it's good to feel, and it's valid, and it's important to not actually shortchange or bypass anger when we have the need to feel it, when we feel betrayed, when we feel upset, when we feel like we're disoriented. That is important. It's appropriate. It's mandatory actually for our own spiritual growth and development. However, we want to move eventually, I think, and this is sort of the gift that comes by itself. It's not something that we force or try to manage. But I think it'll be true for all of us. And I have my good days and my bad days, but it is my feeling that anger is something that can be overcome in love. And let me just share with you a couple of thoughts I have about this from some great thinkers who are much greater thinkers than I am. I think about two individuals. One of them is Martin Luther King Jr., and the other one is Abraham Lincoln. I want to just share a little story about Abraham Lincoln. He competed against a man by the name of, I don't know his first name, but Mr. Stanton hated Abraham Lincoln. And when Abraham Lincoln was running for president of the United States, Stanton actually did everything he could to humiliate and ridicule Lincoln. Yet, when Lincoln was elected as president, he actually appointed Stanton to be his own Secretary of War. In so doing, Lincoln not only served his people by selecting the best person for the job, but he eventually transformed Stanton's hatred into a deep and profound love. Lincoln was able to actually change Stanton by loving him, so much so that when Lincoln was assassinated, it was Stanton who gave the most touching speeches about Lincoln after his death. And then this is what Martin Luther King says about Lincoln in one of his own speeches. He says, if Abraham Lincoln had hated Stanton would have gone to his grave hating Lincoln, and Lincoln would have gone to his grave hating Stanton. Hate destroys the hater as well as the hated, because if you hate your enemies, you have no way to redeem and to transform your enemies. But if you love your enemies, you will discover that at the very root of love is the power of redemption. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. So what Martin Luther King was teaching us is that love is powerful. Love is a force that creates more love, whereas hate is a force that destroys. So how have I tried personally to integrate this? Like I said, you guys, I'm nowhere near perfect on this, but I will say that it has occurred to me that the very most powerful thing that I can do to fight against hatred is by increasing information, by teaching correct principles, helping people understand the nature of the problem, and then by doing the very best that I can to try to understand that people, even people with a lot of power, and even people with a lot of power in our church, are not necessarily evil and wicked. They're not necessarily getting up in the morning and trying to hurt the people that they are in fact hurting. I do believe that most people are very earnest in their beliefs, and they think that what they're doing is right. Their motives, at least in their own minds, are pure. And what I always try to sink back into as often as I possibly can is the words of our Savior, Jesus Christ, on the cross when he said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." That doesn't mean that we don't speak up for truth, that we don't speak truth to power, that we don't teach correct principles. That does not mean that I won't get on this speaker and speak to you as much as I can and encourage agency, choice, wisdom, discernment, a tenacious commitment to the telling of truth and the disclosure of lies. I will do all of those things, while I will also, on the other hand, do my very, very best to forgive them, for they know not what they do. Okay, well, that's the end of this episode, you guys. My gosh, that has been this has been a big one for me. Probably because it's very autobiographical. I want to be by your side as you walk through your grief that you experience, your very legitimate grief that you go through in your faith crisis, as you are going through the things that you're feeling, as you actually hear my voice talking to you and bringing up all of these emotions. There's one side of me that wants to apologize and say, I'm so sorry that I am educating you in such a way that is bringing up such emotion. But on the other hand, I don't want to, and I won't apologize, because we are on a faith journey together. We are walking together from orthodoxy through skepticism. And my goal is that you walk by my side as we both scramble our way through to that beautiful fourth stage of faith development, which is a communal or a mystical faith, where we're able to sort of transcend and include all that we love about the institution, but transcend that which is not okay, and have the ability to then become true leaders and mentors with the spiritual gifts that we have obtained as we have walked our own gardens of Gethsemane in this faith development journey. Thank you guys all for hanging in there with me on this episode. As usual, if you have the heart to do so, please pause and write a positive review on iTunes or Spotify, and rate the podcast. Please share it if you've not already done so. Please subscribe to this podcast. If you would like weekly live transactions with me, where I work with groups of 20 people at a time and work with you through your own faith development journeys, and connect you with other people that you can have real relationships with throughout the week, who are right where you are, so that you aren't feeling that isolation that comes with the grief that we often feel in faith crisis, please reach out to me at info@valeriehamaker.com. And I'm here for you, and I'm here to connect you to other like-hearted and like-minded people in your same place. All right, you guys, thanks for being with me, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.